Welcome to The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. This is a special episode because this is the Halloween edition. This is the second year that I've done this. Last year I was joined by Dr. Andrew Moon to discuss the great pumpkin objection to Reformed epistemology. But tonight you're in for a treat. We're going to be talking about swampman, the swampman objection to proper functionalism. My guest is Dr. Kenny Boyce. Hey there, Dr. Boyce.
Hi, Jordan.
Thank you so much for joining me. Dr. Boyce has been on a couple of times previously, so I would encourage you to go check those videos out if you enjoyed this one. Okay, let's begin by you laying out just very briefly, because this has been discussed a lot on my channel. What is proper functionalism, and what role does it play in religious epistemology?
Right. Yeah, as you just mentioned, this has been discussed on your channel before, in particular by our mutual friend, Andrew Moon, who's also the co-author of the paper that I'll be discussing a little bit later. He's done a lot of interviews on these issues, and they're under the topic of Reformed epistemology, among others. So I'm not going to go over these issues in anything close to the same depth, and I strongly encourage people to go back and watch his videos. But very roughly, proper functionalism about knowledge is the view that our beliefs count as knowledge when they're formed by way of cognitive faculties that are properly functioning, reliably aimed at providing us with true beliefs, and working in the sort of environment for which those faculties were designed, or perhaps to which those faculties have been adapted. Now, what does this have to do with religious epistemology? Well, as Andrew explains in your previous videos, Alvin Plantinga famously appeals to a proper functionalist theory of knowledge to defend the claim that if God exists, it's likely that for many people, their belief in God counts as knowledge, even if it isn't based on other beliefs or arguments. That's because on Plantinga's view, if God exists, it is very likely that God designed our cognitive faculties to produce true beliefs about God, so that when people find themselves believing in God, this is often the result of truth-aimed cognitive proper function. And as Andrew also points out in previous videos, many other views in epistemology deliver similar results about the rationality of belief in God. So the gist of what Plantinga argues for here doesn't really depend on proper functionalism being the right view of knowledge. But still, Plantinga was one of the earliest and remains one of the most prominent defenders of the view that belief in God can be rational and even count as knowledge in the absence of arguments. And he defends this view by appealing to proper functionalism.
Very good. Okay, so now let's get into this swampman objection to proper functionalism. What is it?
Okay, well, first we need a little bit of setup. So according to proper functionalism about knowledge, as I just sketched it out, it's a necessary condition for a creature to have knowledge that its cognitive faculties are properly functioning. The notion of proper function at issue here is supposed to be the same as the notion appealed to in medicine and biology. For example, when the doctor says the average adult human heart is properly functioning when it beats around 70 beats per minute, and yours is malfunctioning because it's beating significantly faster than that. That's the notion of proper function at issue. Now, in general, the claim that a system is properly functioning presupposes that there's a way that the system is supposed to function. So it presupposes that there is what Plantinga calls a design plan, which is just an abstract specification of how the system is supposed to operate under various conditions. Now, it's not obvious that this technical notion of a design plan requires that there actually be a literal designer. Plantinga, being a theist, believes that our biological systems were in fact literally designed by God. But there are some proper functionalists who have a more naturalistic account. And some of them believe, for example, that the way biological systems are supposed to function is determined by a history of natural selection. Very roughly, the idea is that those systems are functioning properly when they're doing what they were selected for. Now, of course, if God guided the process of evolution, as many theists believe, then both of these accounts might be true. Okay, now enter the swamp man. So the scenario I'm about to describe shows up earlier in philosophy, but it was used as an objection to proper functionalism by the philosopher Ernest Sosa. I also want to note, though, that the philosopher Jim Taylor deserves credit for offering a similar objection to proper functionalism before Sosa did, although he doesn't appeal to the swamp man scenario. But without further ado, let me describe the scenario. And since this is a Halloween special, let me try to do it in a spooky manner. So it is a dark and stormy night. Donald is out for a stroll at the local swamp, adjacent to a toxic waste dump. The swamp is gurgling. A powerful burst of lightning strikes a nearby dead tree, resulting in poor Donald's untimely destruction. But at the very same time, as a matter of sheer cosmic happenstance, the materials in the swamp congeal to form a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of Donald, just as he was before his death. The resemblance is uncanny, but entirely accidental. It is just a wild coincidence. Even so, this swamp man emerges, none the wiser, unaware that he is not Donald, and goes on with his walk, eventually taking over Donald's life. Okay, so that's the scenario. What does this have to do with proper functionalism? Well, while the scenario just described is pretty wild, it seems like it is at least broadly logically possible. Really wild things can at least be broadly logically possible. And it also seems to many people that in this scenario, as described, Swamp Man knows things, or at least could know things. At the very least, it seems he could have the same kinds of basic perceptual knowledge that typical human beings have. But remember, according to proper functionalism, it is a necessary condition for a creature's having knowledge that their cognitive faculties are functioning properly. And as I mentioned before, this seems to presuppose that there's a design plan for those functions, one that might have been conferred either by a literal designer or by something like a process of natural selection. But Swamp Man was not created by God and has nothing like an evolutionary history. He's just the accidental arrangement of molecules in the swamp. So it seems like Swamp Man has no design plan. There is no way his cognitive faculties are supposed to work, so he isn't operating according to cognitive proper function. Now, if we take all of these pieces and put them together, we seem to get the result that it's at least broadly logically possible for there to be a creature who knows things, but does not exhibit cognitive proper function. But if that's true, then it isn't true, as proper functionalism says it is, that cognitive proper function is a necessary condition for knowledge. So we have an objection to proper functionalism.
Okay, yeah, you did a really good job of laying that out. So before we look at some solutions to this objection that you and Andrew Moon have offered, let's talk a little bit more. What intuition do you think underlies the swamp man objection?
Right. So in a paper that I wrote with Andrew Moon, it's called In Defense of Proper Functionalism, Cognitive Science Takes on Swamp Man, was published in the journal Synthèse. We argue that the central intuition underlying the swamp man objection is roughly that when two subjects form the same belief in the same way, in the same sort of environment, then if one of those subjects knows, so does the other. Or to put this in the sort of way that analytic philosophers like to put things with variables and such, we take the central intuition underlying the swamp man objection to be expressed by this principle that we call CI, stands for central intuition. So the principle is if a belief B counts as knowledge for a subject S, And another subject, S star, comes to hold B in the same way that S came to hold B in a relevantly similar environment to the one in which S came to hold B, then B counts as knowledge for S star. It does seem like when we reflect on why we think Swampman knows things, that something like this intuition is in the background. The thought is, well, had Donald survived and continued walking through the swamp, his perceptual beliefs would have counted as knowledge. But Swampman is exactly like Donald. He's forming his beliefs in the exact same way, in the exact same environment. So if Donald's beliefs would have counted as knowledge, then Swampman's do as well. Now, while Andrew and I grant that this principle we call CI has an initial appeal, we also end up arguing in our paper that it is false, and that its being false undercuts the swampman objection to proper functionalism. That is, once you're convinced that this principle is false, you should no longer be convinced that Swampman does in fact know things. And we do this by sketching out a series of 6 progressive cases that lead us towards a counterexample to CI.
All right, so go ahead and walk us through these 6 cases that undermine that central intuition to the Swampman objection.
Okay, before I state the cases, I need to point out that they appeal to a phenomenon that cognitive scientists refer to as initial knowledge. There's evidence that human beings come pre-wired, as it were, with certain innate belief-forming tendencies. And they run experiments on infants to verify these things, surprise tests and the like. But from very early ages, infants appear to know, for example, that a set can have unconnected objects as members, that an object will move only on connected, unobstructed paths, that the object that loses its support is the same object as the object that falls, and so on. These are a lot of principles that we just take for granted, but some of these principles would be very difficult to learn through empirical means. And it appears that infants come pre-wired, as it were, to at an appropriate level of cognitive development to have belief-forming tendencies that conform to these principles. So I want to emphasize 4 things here. So first, as I already noted, these belief-forming tendencies are thought to be innate. They emerge at an appropriate stage of cognitive development without being learned. And for that reason, in our paper, we, adopting some terminology from Michael Bergman, refer to these as unlearned doxastic responses. Second, these tendencies really do produce knowledge. When an infant sees a ball roll behind the couch and crawls over to get it, our intuitive judgment is the infant knows that the ball is behind the couch, and that's why they're crawling over there to get it. Third, when human infants form beliefs in these ways, there's something appropriate about their belief-forming response. They are forming their beliefs as they are supposed to. More specifically, the way they form their beliefs is appropriate for human beings as a means of gaining knowledge. These belief-forming processes remain appropriate, furthermore, even if something goes haywire in the external environment and prevents the belief from being an item of knowledge, the infant is still forming their beliefs in the way that they should, or in the way that's appropriate for those beliefs to count as knowledge, as long as everything else outside the infant goes okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we call the kind of appropriateness at issue here warrant appropriateness. Finally, many of these belief-forming tendencies are only contingently reliable. That is, they tend to deliver true beliefs in the sorts of environments to which human beings are adapted, but we can easily imagine bizarre alien environments in which they don't work so well. So this is a little bit of background needed to understand our 6 cases. Is it all right if I just go into the cases at this point?
Yep, yeah.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, here are our 6 cases. Case 1, They get more interesting. This one's boring. They get more interesting as we go along. We'll get to alien abductions and all of that. But case 1, Billy is a human infant who is an unknowing participant in an experimental program concerning early childhood cognitive development. In the process of being experimented upon, he sees a red ball go behind a screen, out of sight, and via an unlearned doxastic response, forms the belief that the round object he just saw is behind the screen. So it seems that Billy's belief in this scenario counts as knowledge. He knows that the ball is behind the screen. Okay, case 2. Billy sees a red ball go behind a screen, but due to a genetic birth defect, he has an abnormal doxastic response to that input and forms the belief that the round object he just saw has ceased to exist. I think it's intuitively clear that Billy's belief in this case is not warrant appropriate. He's not forming his beliefs in the right sort of way for his beliefs to count as knowledge. Okay, case 3. All goes as it did in the previous case. However, owing to the design of the cognitive experiments to which Billy is being subjected, red objects that pass behind the screen placed in front of Billy are, as soon as they're behind the screen and out of Billy's sight, instantly annihilated by a powerful laser, which is also behind the screen and out of Billy's sight. And we'll also add that Billy only tends to have this weird sort of doxastic response, this weird belief-forming process, when he sees red objects being occluded. In other cases, when he sees different colors occluded, he believes in their continued existence, just as any other human child would. Okay, now, like in the previous case, I think it's still intuitively clear that Billy's belief-forming process is not warrant appropriate, even though in this context, it's reliable. It reliably leads him to have true beliefs, but still he's not forming his beliefs in the right sort of way for them to count as knowledge. It is in some important sense merely by accident that he's getting true beliefs in this context. Okay, now let's introduce some aliens. So case 4, Zork, and I owe this alien name to Andrew. I like this alien name. Zork, unlike Billy, is an alien child who lives on another planet, although members of his species are very human-like. They're so human-like, in fact, that even down to the molecular level, it's difficult to distinguish them from human beings. Furthermore, Zork's planet is very much like Earth, with one important exception. Owing to some odd features of its magnetic field and some currently unknown to Earth scientists quantum phenomenon, strange macroscopic-sized red spherical particles frequently pop into existence in the presence of observers on Zork's planet and then disappear. Now, these particles have a further odd property. If one of them pops into existence in the presence of a group of observers, then if any one of those observers stops observing that particle, it immediately ceases to exist. So Zork, who is also an unknowing subject of cognitive experiments by adult members of his species, sees one of these particles go behind a screen and, via an unlearned doxastic response, forms the belief that the round object he just saw has ceased to exist. Now, it seems that this belief-forming process is warrant appropriate for members of Zork's species. Or at least I think we should grant that if Billy's belief in the very first case, where he sees the ball go behind the screen and believes that it still exists, counts as knowledge, then Zork's belief could also count as knowledge. They're both unlearned doxastic responses that are contingently reliable in the sorts of environments for which these species have been adapted. So we think that any objection to thinking that one of these beliefs counts as knowledge would also be an objection to thinking that the other does. So we think if Billy knows, and he does in the very first case, then we can successfully stipulate that Zork knows as well, that Zork's belief counts as knowledge. Okay, another case, case 5. Billy has been abducted by aliens of Zork's species and taken to Zork's planet. Furthermore, Billy has exactly the same sorts of belief-forming tendencies that he was stipulated to have in the previous case involving Billy, the one where the balls are going behind the screen and being annihilated by a laser. Bill believes they cease to exist. He has the same tendencies. He sees one of the strange red spherical particles from Zork's world pass behind a screen and believes that it has ceased to exist. Now, I think if we say in case 3 that Billy's belief doesn't count as knowledge because it's not warrant appropriate, we should say the same thing about this case. His belief doesn't count as knowledge in this case because he's not forming his belief in the right sort of way for it to count as knowledge. Okay, case 6. Billy and Zork are both present in a laboratory on Zork's planet. Both simultaneously observe one of the strange red spherical particles from Zork's planet pass behind a screen. All goes for Zork as it did in case 4. That is the previous case where we introduced Zork. He sees the particle go behind the screen. He thinks it ceases to exist. All goes for Billy as it did in case 5. So he sees the particle go behind the screen. He thinks it ceased to exist. Consequently, both Zork and Billy form the belief that the round object that they just saw has ceased to exist. So I think, given all of the above, we should accept that Zork's belief counts as knowledge because it's the appropriate sort of response for members of his species, but Billy's does not because it's not the appropriate sort of response for members of his species. So we're almost at a counterexample to CI. All we need to do is add the stipulation that Billy forms his beliefs in the same way, in the sense that it is at issue in CI, that Zork does. But there seems to be no barrier to our doing that, unless whether his cognitive faculties are properly functioning counts as part of whether it's the same way. But the defender of the swampman objection is not going to want to say that because they don't want proper function to be what makes the belief the right sort of way to count as knowledge. So setting that aside, there's no barrier to stipulating that Billy and Zork form their beliefs in the same way. We could even imagine that the genetic birth defect that Billy acquires makes it so that his belief forming tendencies are physically identical. The same kind of physical processes go on in his brain that go on in Zork's brain. So Andrew and I maintain we can add the stipulation. Once that stipulation is added, we get a counterexample to CI. We have two beings existing in the same sort of environment, forming their belief in the same way, but Zork's belief counts as knowledge and Billy's does not. So we think CI, the central intuition that underlies the swampman objection, is false, and that should lead us to doubt our initial judgment that swampman knows things. It should lead us to give up that judgment. But there's more. Since Billy and Zork form beliefs in the same environment and in the same way, it seems that the only facts left over to explain why one belief counts as knowledge, but the other does not, are facts about proper function and species membership. So this indicates that either proper function is a necessary condition for knowledge, or that the appropriate process of belief formation required for knowledge is relative to the species of the believer. Either way, we're left with new evidence in favor of proper functionalism. So ironically, reflection on an alleged counterexample to proper functionalism has led us to discover further evidence in its favor.
You summed all that up really, really well, and I appreciate you coming on to do it. Do you want to say anything else in conclusion?
I don't know if I have anything in particular to say. I like proper functionalism. I think it's the correct view. I would encourage your audience to investigate. There's also a paper by Jeff Tolly, though, responding to Andrew Moon's and my paper. And I think he's wrong, but I would also encourage your readers to check that out for a balanced story here.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and that concludes this Halloween edition of Ask a Scholar. See you next year.